In this video, I'm going to be painting the oberschutze in gefrieter in 1/35 scale by scale 75. These D.A.K figures will make a perfect addition to my Kugelwagen diorama. The figures are nicely cast in grey resin and both come with a choice of two heads. To keep the figures steady whilst painting, I pressed them into a cube of milliput and left it to dry. The figures were then pressed and PVA glued into the positive indentations that were left behind. This is the second video in my Kugelwagen diorama series, so watch out in the future for the next one. Okay, so that's enough of the bare resin figures. Let's get some paint on them. As usual, I started with primer. For this I used Badger Grey Styron Res. The primer was applied in two light coats with my 0.2 Hadron Steenbeck Infinity CR. Styron Res needs to be sprayed at high pressure, so I used 25 psi for best results. As with most of my figures, I started on the flesh areas. I mixed up a base flesh layer out of Vallejo Dark Flesh, Hull Red, Dark Vermilion and Dark Prussian Blue. Once I'd mixed up a shade I was happy with, I started applying it to the flesh areas. For most of my brushwork, I used a 00 Kolinsky Sable. I have quite the collection of Kolinsky Sable brushes. Some of my favourites are Raphael 8404, Da Vinci Maestro, ProArt Series 2A Designer, but for the most of this build I'll be using the Artist Opus Series S. I started with a mid-tone flesh colour because I didn't want the shadows to be too strong. The next step was to paint the eyes. For the whites of the eyes, I used a mix of ivory and green-grey. It's always best to use an off-white for the whites of the eyes, otherwise they can look too stark. I paint the eyes at this stage because it's easy to correct any mistakes if I make any. The whites of the eyes were painted with a horizontal swipe of the paintbrush. If I paint these too big, it doesn't matter because I can close the eyes a bit with the base colour afterwards. For the iris, I painted a vertical stripe of a dark brown colour. The pupil then followed with a small speck of black. It's areas like this where the good point of a Kolinsky Sable paintbrush comes in handy. The first highlight colour for the face was mixed from Hull Red, Sunny Skin Tone and a dash of Dark Prussian and Dark Vermilion. This mix was then carefully painted on the raised areas of the face, like the cheekbones, forehead, nose and chin. This stage of highlighting was built up several times until I was happy with the result. For the next highlight layer, I mixed the Vallejo colours Sunny Skin Tone, Deep Yellow, Dark Vermilion and Ivory. I wanted these highlights to look quite sunny, so I used lots of warm tones. These highlights were painted on in a way similar to before, only a bit more targeted. I worked the paint onto the extremities of the face and anywhere that I wanted to catch the light. The cheeks were painted in a thinner version of the same mix. Here, I reinforced some shadows underneath the cheeks with the base flesh colour from earlier. This was carefully blended whilst the brush was still wet. I added some more highlight colours to blend the cheek shading in even further. For the final highlight layers, I added more ivory to my sunny highlight mix. Try not to overdo this step because your hard work can come undone really quickly. With the faces done, it was time to move on to the uniforms. I used two main mixes for my D.A.K uniforms. The tan shade I mixed from Vallejo English Uniform, Buff and Ivory. And for the greener uniform shade, I used Russian Uniform World War II. These uniform colours were then carefully blocked in. With the uniform colours blocked in, it was time to move on to some highlights and shading. When shading the green uniform, I added some German Camouflage Dark Green and German Camouflage Bright Green to darken the shade. To shade the tan colour, I added some German Sea Black Brown. For the highlights, I added Ivory and Buff to both mixes. For the green, I introduced some German camouflage bright green to help keep my greens green. Although it's not very visible here, I started painting in the shadow colours in logical areas. The process was then repeated for the figure with the green camouflage jacket. Unfortunately, I lost the footage of me painting the webbing. Also, I got a new phone halfway through filming this, so the footage looks slightly different. After the webbing was magically painted, I decided to add some stripes to the scarf on one of the figures. These were painted on very carefully with Vallejo dark red. I painted the canteen with a mix of cavalry brown and deep yellow. This was later shaded with German sea black brown. This looks really neon here, but I promise you it looks less vibrant in real life. I prepared a base layer for the wood on the grenade with VMS Oil Expert Enhancing Medium Matte and Artist Oils Yellow Ochre and White. The VMS Oil Enhancing Medium really cuts down the drying time on oil paints. And I know, my palette really needs a clean. The light wood mix was then painted on the wooden grenade handle. For the second wood colour, I used a mix of burnt umber and French ultramarine. This was then painted again on the handle of the grenade. With a really tatty brush, I brushed the oil paint in the direction I wanted the green to go. The badges and insignias on the model were painted with Dark Star Metallics pewter. Dark Star have some really nice metallic colours, but they work better almost dry brushed on. This tends to burnish the paint a little bit, giving it more of a sheen. Here I'm adding a wash of Vallejo Black to the badge. The excess was wicked away with a clean brush. I painted the mess tin in a blacky colour using a mix of Vallejo Black and Field Blue. The strap was then painted with Vallejo Leather Brown. The metal parts of the weapons were painted in a mix of Vallejo Black and Dark Prussian Blue. These were then dry brushed with Dark Star. To finish off the metal areas of the weapons, I mixed up a wash of Vallejo Black and Prussian Blue. I made sure that this wash had a blue bias. I painted the strap for the MP40 with Vallejo Russian Uniform World War II. This was highlighted with buff. I used the same wood grain technique from before on the rifle. I used a slightly different colour palette for the rifle though, mixing only burnt sienna and burnt umber. I also added some more specific wood graining with a fine sable brush. For the pistol holster, I mixed up a leather colour out of black and bright orange. This is one of my favourite colour mixes for leather. You can simply add more orange for highlights as you need. I base coated the holster with a dark version of the leather mix. The highlights were then built up incrementally, adding more orange to each layer. After what seemed like hundreds of layers, I was happy with the shading on the holster. I mixed some VMS Sand Pigment 4 with the Enamel 2.0 binders. This was mixed into a kind of sandy wash. The pigment and binder mix was then brushed onto the legs and feet of the figures. I'll put some more pigments on them when I attach the figures to the diorama base in a later video. For the last step, I mixed up some VMS matte varnish with their airbrush thinners. I then gave it a good shake. The matte varnish was sprayed in several light coats over the entirety of both of the figures. Once the varnish was dry, the figures were complete. Before we get to the final images, I want to say a big thanks to my patrons. You guys are awesome. If you're interested in becoming a patron, please check out the link below. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. Also, let me know in the comments how I got on. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and get notified whenever I upload a new video. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.